Hey guys, Melvin here. Welcome to the attic. We're going to be reading a story from the RPghorrorstories subreddit. This one was posted by user OrdinaryMixture8525. It's about a DM that begins a game of Warhammer fantasy role-playing with a very different tone in mind than what their trio of bloodthirsty players get up to. Murder, cannibalism, and several cover-ups. By the way, if you haven't already, please like, comment, subscribe, and hit the notification bell to know when I upload new videos. Without further ado, let's check it out. This happened almost a decade ago, when I was still at the university and had been role-playing, both as a player and as a DM for 5 years or so. My memory on the matter is a little hazy after all these years, but I think I remember the general gist of things. This is the tale of my absolute worst role-playing experience as a game master. 2 friends of mine got in touch with me, saying they were looking for some activity to chill and wind down with, and asked if I could run a game for the 2 of them and a third guy I didn't know very well. I asked if they'd be happy with anything, and they said yes. Given I didn't have much of a prep time to come up with anything terribly unique for them, I decided I'd run them through a homebrew opening for an adventure game that I had been running for another playgroup recently. Again, they said yes, and I gave them the information they needed to roll up their characters, and we agreed to meet in a couple of days for the game. The setup for the game was this. The player characters were all exiled from their former homeland after participating in a failed peasant rebellion. They had now come to this foreign city that was openly hostile and unwelcoming to them. They had managed to secure themselves a shitty house to live in at the slums, and had been lucky enough to score themselves a job at a local portside tavern that was run by a lecherous old man that treated them poorly and didn't pay them nearly enough, considering how dangerous the place was as a working environment. The place was essentially like the Mos Eisley Cantina mixed with a whorehouse. The system we used for this was Warhammer Fantasy 2nd Edition, which is a system filled with all kinds of peasant careers, stuff like cooks, barbers, chimney sweeps, etc. I forgot what everyone's characters were by their trade, because it was such a long time ago, but I think they were pretty mundane, lower-class characters. Now, this is where I believe most of the problem stemmed from. Essentially, what I wanted to do was put the player characters in a spot where they weren't attached to their current lives, and where they had nothing to lose. So when the call for adventure would finally come, they would be eager to take it. The idea was that the players would come upon an old treasure map that was in the possession of a filthy pirate that would die in the tavern. Basically the setup for Treasure Island. I didn't communicate to them beforehand that this was where I was going with it. I wanted the light at the end of the tunnel, the promise for treasure and adventure, to seem all the more brighter when it would finally appear. My guess is that the players thought I was out just to torture them and got a kick out of watching their characters being put through shit. So, they already had a very rebellious attitude from the get-go. The session was supposed to be about them acquiring the map and figuring out what it was. The main conflicts were going to be, number 1, how would the players deal with the nasty old tavern owner who would want in on the job and who would no doubt want to gobble up most of the treasure for himself if it got to that point? Would they keep it a secret from him? If so, given that the guy was basically the only person of wealth that they knew in this hostile city, how would they fund an expedition to go get the treasure by themselves? Number 2, how would the players deal with the dead pirate's former crewmates when they would show up looking for their dead friend who had stolen the map from them? I should have realized right away that there were going to be problems with this game, because there was a lot of weed and alcohol involved. I usually have a couple of beers when I'm DMing to help me relax, but I try to stay relatively sober when I DM to stay on top of things. The other guys had no such restrictions. We start off the session by me describing to them what was a pretty typical morning for their characters in this new city. They woke up to rainwater falling down on them from a hole in their roof, their muscles aching from the cold and drafty conditions they had to sleep in. Given there was not much for them to do at the slums, and because I said they were feeling hungry, they decided to go to their workplace to take advantage of the only good employee benefit they were offered over there, a free meal. Given that the guys were already intoxicated and had a short attention span, rather than waiting for the game to get to the hook, they were already looking for completely random passerbys to loot and or murder. I somehow managed to stop this from happening by hinting that the streets were really crowded at this time of day and they would certainly get into trouble for it, which in hindsight didn't make that much sense since it was raining, but hey, I guess it could have been a busy part of town. They get to the tavern, which was mostly empty given it was relatively early in the day. They say hi to some of the tavern girls and enjoy their free meal. Enter the owner of the establishment.
Since you maggots are good enough to come here and eat my food, you are good enough to work as well.
I quickly assign them some menial tasks that the owner wants taken care of. I had one of the guys scrubbing the floors from last night's puke and spilled drinks, and one of them to act as the bouncer. Not that there were many guys to bounce. Now, the remaining one of the three I put to work at the counter. This triggered some awful things in him that I did not foresee. The player in question had been working as a cashier for a while, a job he hated, under a really shitty boss. Apparently me putting his character in a similar spot was extremely uncomfortable for him, and he went on a full detached murder hobo mode for the rest of the session. Not that it had been that much better before it either, given they had already been looking for random targets to mug in the streets. Eventually, I draw their attention to a filthy-looking pirate that walks into the tavern. I go into detail how the guy looks like he is in really bad shape physically, coughing and breathing heavily, and looking like he has been on the binge for several days. This was the guy who had stolen the treasure map from his former crew, but the players obviously don't know it yet. I wasn't even done with my description when the player working the counter announces that he walks behind the dude and attempts to strangle the life out of him. In a moment that I'm not too proud of, I snap at the dude. I ask him what would possibly motivate his character at this very moment in front of the tavern owner, tavern girls, and some other customers as witnesses, to kill the man right then and there in cold blood. After thinking about it and coming to the conclusion that the answer was nothing, he backs off. We agree to rewind and I tell them that the guy orders a stiff drink, downs it greedily, and then expresses his eagerness to get it on with one of the tavern girls. The owner handles the situation, takes the guy's money, and escorts him into a private room with one of the girls. Given that the atmosphere at the table had gotten quite tense, we agreed to take a small break. I have a smoke outside, feeling bummed that I was dragged into running a game when the players were apparently just looking for a murder simulator, a style of role-playing that I'm not particularly fond of. I tell myself that it's just because they're intoxicated and joking around. I take a deep breath and decide, fuck it, let them play it their way, and head back inside. I tell the players that they hear a scream of terror coming from the private room. They rush to the scene and discover the tavern girl half naked on the bed, pointing at the pirate man lying on the floor, dead from a heart attack. They tell the girl to get out, and after confirming that the guy was indeed dead, two of the players immediately start going through his belongings as the owner of the tavern enters the room. I forget exactly what I said, but I think the owner was berating them for essentially robbing the customer instead of getting help, something that rubbed them the wrong way, which was really the intention of that NPC anyways. The one player that wasn't currently in the process of stripping the dead man of all his belongings sneaks up behind the owner and attacks him. Well, that didn't take long. I think to myself and call for an attack roll, and it's a hit. Since the owner is caught completely off guard, I tell the player he gets an extra damage die. He rolls really well and tackles the grumpy old man against the wall, snapping his neck and killing him instantly. Now they have another body to loot, and this seems to make them happy. They basically completely ignore the treasure map, which was the entire point of the game, since they now have a murder to cover up. I was expecting them to close down the tavern for the day and dump the body into the ocean at night or something, but these players came up with something way more horrifying. One of the guys announces that he goes to the tavern kitchen and gets a butcher knife and proceeds to chop the body of the owner into pieces. Not only that, but he announces his intention of cooking up the meat and serving it to the customers, together with the signature house stew that the place was known for. I call for some rolls, and long story short, they basically managed to do it without anyone catching on. I think they even told me that they would eat some of the stew themselves to celebrate this great occasion of becoming the new tavern owners. Now, I'm not a squeamish guy, and I've seen players pulling all kinds of shit in games before, but cannibalism is one of those subjects that really turns my stomach. I was feeling sick, and I should have probably just told them that this stuff made me feel uncomfortable, and I don't want to play anymore. Maybe I was still harboring hopes of being able to salvage the game and get them interested in the map, or maybe I just didn't want the game to have a sour ending. But I decided to keep it going. Next day, a gang of rough-looking pirates show up at the tavern, asking questions about their former crewmate. They had gathered enough information around town to know that some folks had seen him entering this place yesterday. They were openly asking about the map as well. This was me trying to hint that the map was probably extremely important. The players come up with a pretty decent cover story on the spot. They tell the pirates that the man showed up, had a lengthy conversation about something with the tavern owner, and the two of them set out together and never came back. They roll really well on the bluff, and after spending a while looking around the place, the group of pirates leaves. The players manage to divert their attention enough to keep them away from the back room where they had stored the dead pirate's body, and which was still completely covered in the chopped up owner's blood. The players realize they should probably do something about the grisly scene in the room and start scrubbing it clean before it really starts to stink. The pirates continue their search elsewhere, but they leave behind one guy to keep an eye on the place. The players quickly hone in on him, and 3 against 1, he is quickly dispatched. He ends up in the stew as well. I think at this point I was numb to the horror of what these guys were doing, and I didn't really have any NPCs that I could logically oppose their actions with. So all I could do was just fast forward through most of it. Remember, they were not only preparing meals with human flesh, but also serving it to unknowing customers. I basically end up fast forwarding a couple of days. The players announce that they will start looking for someone to analyze the map and purchase it from them, once again completely ignoring the treasure hunt plot hook. At this point, I decide I've had enough and proceed to wrap things up with the following scene. Since the tavern owner had disappeared without notice, some of his friends and relatives had gotten in touch with the city guard, and they had started an investigation. When the guardsmen tasked with the investigation showed up at the tavern, the players were actually ready for it. I forgot what they had done about the rest of the tavern workers. Either they had paid for their silence about the matter from the tavern owner's private stash they now had access to, or, more likely with these guys, had intimidated their mouths shut. Either way, it was a relatively easy task, given none of the workers had any real love for the old man. One of the guys even had some sort of forgery skill, and since he had plenty of samples of the tavern owner's handwriting, he had managed to write up a document that basically announced the guy had gone out of town, and had given the PCs temporary control over the establishment until he returns. We actually had a pretty tense scene of the guardsmen going through the tavern, looking for clues and doing interrogations, and then the players coming up with semi-convincing lies backed up by good bluff rolls. After some opposed rolls by the guardsmen, I announce, "Okay, the guards leave, and the place is yours for now." And I essentially wrap things up with that. I think I was hinting that we would move things forward some other day, but it was a flat-out lie on my part. I honestly had no desire to keep going with the game anymore, after the mental stress I had been put through by these guys. Now, honestly, without the creepy cannibalistic angle and the complete lack of humanity from any of the player characters, I'm thinking it could have actually been a decent start of a campaign. Bunch of shady bastards taking over a rough portside tavern. When the guy they left behind vanished as well, the pirates would certainly figure out there was something off about the place and come back to do more digging into the matter. So, there was still a potential for some cool things happening with that. I certainly didn't handle things very well as the game master. I should have immediately said I wasn't okay with some of their actions. And I also should have been more accepting of them not taking the plot hook of the treasure map, instead of trying to force feed it to them. But if I learned anything from this experience, it's that I definitely should communicate my intentions and expectations for a campaign better before I sit down to play with a group. There needs to be some discussion about the overall tone of the campaign, even at the risk of some spoilers, so that the players don't sit down to play a completely different game than the DM. Also, having more sober players definitely helps. Even though the system we used was Warhammer Fantasy, the setting itself was a pretty generic and, to be honest, uninspired low fantasy homebrew. It could have been any setting really. Even in Warhammer, where some of these atrocities would be relatively common, they would usually be committed for a reason, either due to savage upbringing, as a terror tactic, or to gain the favor of the Chaos Gods, or whatever have you. What horrified me here was the senselessness of it all. Horrible actions without anything to gain from them. Two of these players also later on wrecked a long-running campaign, where I was a player, not the DM, that I was rather fond of. They joined that campaign as late additions, and some weeks later, 3 of the 5 players, me included, just decided to stop playing because we didn't want to deal with them anymore. But that is a whole nother story. This sounded like a pretty harrowing experience for the DM, but you know what? I can't help but kind of like this group of terrible miscreants. They took the grimdark setting around them and felt right at home, despite this being quite an extreme case. I think it shows the strength of a skill-based role-playing system like Warhammer Fantasy. DMs and players have more flexibility with how to improvise, and cool little details can emerge, like that one PC's forgery skill being used to make it look like the scumbags legitimately had temporary ownership of the tavern. I might also be a sucker for the port-side setting. It feels perfect for the tone, and not one you see utilized too often. Even though the session did not go as expected, OP has a great hook for this campaign, with a stellar adaptation of Treasure Island's setup. Alright everyone, that's it for tonight. Thank you for joining me here in the attic, and take care of yourselves out there. This is Melvin, in the attic, signing out.